the so-called United States, many advocates of a Green New Deal have included the call for prison abolition, a vision that would also expand voting rights in a democratic system, as inmates are currently prevented from voting. But in Canada, the connection between a Green New Deal, environmental devastation, pipelines, and incarceration to institutionalized racism is not drawn often enough. And we want to talk about why prison abolition needs to enter the mainstream understanding of what climate work is. So how does entering the carceral system relate to climate justice? Undoing entrenched systems of racism and violence and moving towards a just society begins with reparations, alternatives to policing, and the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. And these are integral foundational blocks for justice. So what obligation does climate justice advocates have to include principles of restorative and transformative justice in their work? And what can that look like? How can the climate movement work for prison abolition as a core strategy for shared liberation and a society where all are welcome and safe? So we have three panelists with us today. We have Robin Maynard, Cedar, and Elle Jones. We're going to go in that order. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Robin Maynard. Robin Maynard is a PhD student and Vanier Scholar at the University of Toronto and the author of Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. Policing Black Lives is a national bestseller, currently in its third printing, designated as one of the best 100 books of 2017 by the Hill Times, listed in the Walrus Best Books of 2018, shortlisted for an Atlantic Book Award, the Concordia University First Book Prize, and the Mavis Gallant Prize for nonfiction, and the winner of the 2017 annual Errol Morris Book Prize. This work received a starred review in Publishers Weekly, as well as a glowing coverage in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, Now Toronto, Maclean's, and the Ottawa Citizen. In the words of the Winnipeg Free Press, every Canadian, Black, white, Indigenous, or otherwise, could benefit from reading Maynard's frank and thorough assessment of racism in Canada. In fall of 2018, the book was published in French, and it is currently a finalist for the 2019 Prix de Libraire in the category of essay. Maynard, who won 2018 Author of the Year by Montreal's Black History Month, has published writing in the Washington Post, the World Policy Journal, the Toronto Star, Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, Canadian Women's Studies, Critical Ethnic Studies in Journal, Scholar and Feminist Journal Forthcoming, as well as an essay in Maisonneuve Magazine, which won the acclaim for most read essay of 2017. Her writing on race, gender, and discrimination is taught widely in universities across Canada and the United States. Her expertise is regularly sought in local, national, and international media outlets, and she has spoken before parliamentary subcommittees, the Human Rights Committee of the Senate, and the United Nations Working Group of Experts of People on African Descent. Maynard has a long history of involvement in community activism and advocacy. She's been part of grassroots movements against racial profiling, police violence, detentions, and deportation for over a decade, and has an extensive work history in harm reduction-based service provision, serving sex workers, drug users, incarcerated women, and marginalized youth in Montreal. She is currently working toward the completion of a new book manuscript. Welcome, Robin. We'll throw to you first. I think you're on mute, Robin.
Thanks so much for having me. I am really glad to be here with such great company. I'm really happy to be speaking with Elle Jones and Cedar about what I think is one of the, the really crucial discussions of our time, which is what does prison abolition mean for climate justice? I wanted to speak in a way that makes sense for people that are new to the basic tenets of prison abolition, and also hopefully get into some specifics that will bring helpful analysis for those in the climate justice movements who are also more aware of abolition politics. So first, though, before moving forward, I just wanted to briefly talk about how I'm conceiving of abolition so that it's not something that's taken for granted. Abolition, in the way that I'll be speaking about it today, means acknowledging the incomplete abolition of slavery upon that, the so-called emancipation in 1834, the end of formal chattel slavery being legalized in Britain's settler outposts that have become Canada. The ending of these forms of racial punishment have also endured, even if they've undertaken important shifts in a wide assortment of state institutions. So in terms of policing, prisons, detention centers, as well child welfare and schools. But in particular, if we follow Angela Davis, incarceration emerges as a really important way of controlling Black people's lives in the wake of slavery's abolition. You can see the historic link, in Canada, where the first prison was built in 1834, the year that slavery was abolished. Policing was really the front arm of controlling Black people's and Black indigenous people's movements in public spaces, vis-a-vis crime control, the war on drugs, all of these issues that developed later, of course, in the 20th century. So I just wanted us to think about what abolition means in that context. I'm going to be speaking more about Black populations, but of course in Canada, a country with a long and still not over history of settler colonialism, we need to understand that other racialized kinds of control are built into this as well. So when we speak about abolition, it's thinking about the elimination of slavery's institutional afterlife. So that means the end of prisons, the end of border regulations in particular, and also about building a different kind of society that's not based on just absence, but also the presence of fuller forms of justice that don't rely on placing people in cages, not looking towards some kind of racially proportionate harm where there is an identical, representation of Black and white and indigenous, for example, people proportionate to our population in the prison, but to actually end that violence entirely. So having established sort of the means of where we're going, I thought it would be helpful then to say, why prison abolition and climate justice. And I think to do this topic its own justice, it actually helps to attend to the terms in the opposite way. So what is the relationship between captivity and climate injustice? I think if we look at it this way, it helps us to oppose both of these things if we understand how they both sort of have historically evolved together and how they function together today. So prisoners, of course, whether they're incarcerated in prisons or jails or immigration detention centers, are captive populations subject to deprivation, vulnerable to extreme kinds of neglect, especially Black and indigenous populations due to just systemic racist neglect. So what does this mean in the context of climate disaster? Of course, there are very clear ways of understanding that, right? If we look to, for example, heat waves in the United States, where prisoners across the country have been talking about chronic abuse due to extreme heat, which we also saw, in Burnside just last summer, right? We see that the way that already being deprived of the ability to move, the ability to have really any of what are considered rights, places people who are incarcerated in any form at extreme risk of what, some of the ways that we think about climate disaster that we're already living with, right? Which heat waves are already something that's starting to be very much a part of our lives. Something that I think we need to be wary of, though, as well, is that the way that the carceral state, if we don't think about prison abolition, if we just think about, for example, the ways that that could harm prisoners, then the carceral state also upholds itself as a way of solving climate injustice. So one primary way that that's been done, and Justin Pichet had sent a really great article along about this, looks at actually how prisons have been sort of remarketing themselves as proponents of green energy. We see this as well with the creation of the Laval Immigration Prevention Center, or that's what it's called that's the translation from French. The Laval Immigration Detention Center is marketing the new Immigration Detention Center as using, of course, leadership in energy and environmental design standards as if it's sort of this a solution to the kinds of racial injustices that we're seeing. So I think we need to be able to answer the question, why not build bigger, greener prisons, make them more disaster ready? And we need to think about how reforming prisons or greening them is not something that those of us concerned with the environment should allow ourselves to be concerned with. We should actually be thinking more broadly about what it would mean to end the global and racial harms of environmental devastation, as well as ending different racialized kinds of punishment. So to help understand this, I just wanted to briefly turn towards a few of the historical explorations between captivity and climate injustice. And I believe that Elle wants to speak to this as well, so I'll try not to take too much time on it. But I think it's important that we understand that the intersections between racial and environmental devastation have long-standing roots and one cannot be stopped without the other, that these are two intersecting kinds of harms that have always been. That the climate emergency is modern, but the racially disproportionate effects are modern, but the roots of this massive, ecological devastation, this massive kinds of racialized captivity of Black people in prison, of indigenous people in prison, were not historically inevitable. but instead these two things evolved alongside. The ecological devastation evolved alongside a history of racialized control. So if we think about racial violence and environmental violence as intertwined, we can look to the pillaging of the vast majority of the world's resources, how this emerged from indigenous genocide, the labor of captive Africans in North, South America, and the Caribbean, and the partitioning of Africa into resources to steal and people to rule over. You know, if we understand slavery as propelling the capitalist revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the ensuing apocalyptic disaster of mass industrialization, deforestation of indigenous territories of Canada, Europe, South America, globally, I think it makes a lot more sense that we can see how these harms have always functioned together. To give just one example, if we look to the Royal Dutch Shell Company, for example, which is now, you know, by the time of Nigerian independence in 1960, it was one of the most powerful corporations that had been taking oil from the region for decades, right? And we see that now the Nigerian Delta is home to 159 oil fields with over 1,000 oil wells, right? So if we think about the people that are currently facing detention and deportation in Canada, right? We have this mass number of Nigerian people who have crossed the border from the United States into Canada, those that are considered the so-called refugee crisis, but this is still very much linked to ongoing kinds of resource extraction and neo-imperialism in this moment. One example that I think really helps make this clear in terms of the ways that incarceration was brought to light by Black Lives Matter United Kingdom, who stopped flights a few years ago at Grand Heathrow Airport, saying that Black people were marked as first to die in the climate crisis, pointing to the massive emissions in Britain that were causing climate change and causing displacement of African peoples all over the world. So I think this shows us many things, that what's called the migrant crisis, which is really the world's highest rates of displacement since World War II, and is very much related to the high rates of detention and deportation that we're seeing, is deeply related to environmental collapse, and that this emerges from the longstanding history of racial capitalism. At the end of formal colonization, we saw, of course, a massive increase in the control of migrants entering countries like Canada, and again, that coincided with the creation of the prison industrial complex, of immigration jails proliferating just at the same time as we see those neocolonial structural adjustment programs imposing monoculture, devastating local ecology, and preventing people's ability to move freely, right? So that's really important that we actually view all of these kinds of injustices as both historically and presently wrapped up in one another. Thinking about how in a country like Canada, most Black people born elsewhere, where most Black people were born elsewhere, both prisons and immigration detention centers can be understood of having grown out of attempts to control Black and racialized people's entry, even as Canada, along with the United States and European industries, continue to pillage Black people's homelands worldwide. The mass criminalization of Black people is one of ways of controlling the movement across borders, which is especially in the current moment a response to the climate crisis, I apologize. So I believe I'm pretty much at time. I guess the last thing that I wanted to point to, I have 1 minute, so I'll just really briefly point to that example that I briefly raised, which is the Laval Immigration Detention Center, because as we can see, I've spoken to lawyers there that have talked about that. Anyhow, there are really high rates of Black migrants there. Many of them are migrants who have first been criminalized and are now facing deportation, but it really is touting itself as, a green solution after the 2016 migrant hunger strike that took place when Ralph Goodall pledged, $138 million to rebuild, to sort of address these issues. Instead, they ended up deciding to build a new immigration detention center, which is pledging itself as energy efficient and more humane. So this again poses a really important moment, and there are protests happening, I believe even today and again in October, to de-link these issues. So finally, I'll just finish and say that prison abolition has lessons for the climate justice movement as well, because abolition demands more than piecemeal reforms, more than green and eco prisons, more than humane prisons, but an end to prisons and into caging more broadly. So similarly, I think that of course, really the deep kinds of climate justice that we see, understand that these piecemeal reforms, like carbon credits, for example, are not going to solve the massive devastation and the ecological devastation that we're currently seeing under capitalism. So just to end by saying that abolition is not just ending racial captivity, it's a process of world building. And if we view that world building as also interrupting the devastating logic of racial capitalism and climate destruction, we can really start to imagine a freer world.
Thank you so much, Robin. You are welcome to go over time too. And also for everyone that's just joining us, we're kicking off the Prison Abolition and Climate Justice panel. If you want to ask questions or you have thoughts you want to add, we invite you to engage in the chat and talk with each other. The panelists can see what you're saying as well. And also as speakers are having their speaking blocks, we encourage you to write down questions, put them aside because we will have a Q&A after, and we are hoping that people will engage with it. We want to pull out a couple of threads about what Robin's saying as well is, when we think about mainstream climate movements, this word greenwashing comes up, and the greenwashing of the capitalist system that is deeply invested in racial inequity is flourishing in how we conceive of prisons. So to bring that into how we're talking about our analysis, and if there are terms that you don't understand as well, please write those down also. We'd be happy to answer those afterwards. I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Cedar. Cedar is an anarchist who lives in Hamilton, Ontario, and who, through involvement in various struggles over the years, has ended up with a fair bit of firsthand experience of prison, most recently in June of this year, following the successful defense of Pride Hamilton from far-right aggression. Cedar sees prison and police as a fundamental issue that any social or environmental struggle must confront, since beneath the level of discourse, the state and capitalists defend their interests with these instruments of naked force. Thanks for joining us, Cedar.
Hi. Thank you so much for that introduction. Gosh, I don't have very much experience with this format, so I hope if ever you can't hear me, I hope somebody will just jump in and cut me off and let me know. I feel a little bit scattered, honestly. Okay, I'll come a little bit closer, thank you. I feel a little bit scattered, honestly, because we're just getting evicted today, so you can see I'm sitting here in my empty house right next to the modem on the floor, just dealing with moving and all of these things, so it's a bit of a confusing time, but yeah, like Maya said, I live in Hamilton, where I've been involved in lots of different kinds of social struggles over the years and environmental struggles, specifically around anti-gentrification and opposing pipelines, like the Line 9 pipeline through the area. Yeah, and through this work, I've experienced a lot of state repression. And repression is a word that I guess we use to just refer to the kinds of violence that the state reserves using its armed forces, which is like the police or soldiers or intelligence agencies, and how they use that violence to crush forms of dissent that go beyond their ability to kind of control and bring them back into this narrative of democracy and discourse and conversation that we're all having. So yeah, I guess over the years I've been to jail 5 times for protest activity in different ways. Mostly this has been for conspiracy charges. So it's just related to organizing protests or actions of various kinds and then getting targeted for that work. Yeah, and most recently that was with stuff in Hamilton around Pride and the far right. I was hoping there was another person here today who was going to talk more about issues related to parole, but that was it was interesting because that was for a parole violation, which is just such a reminder of the way that prison follows people out into society, right? We think about it as being just these walls, just these cages, but in fact it's a whole suite of systems of control that shape our behavior in some very fundamental ways. So what I want to talk about today is just why I think everyone should care about prison, even if you're never going to go in there yourself, even if you never have anyone you care about on the inside. I want to talk about why I think this matters deeply to everybody who cares about creating a better world. I mean, it's kind of funny because people don't like to talk about prison very much, which I guess in some ways makes sense just because one of the first things that prison produces is silence. From the courtroom, where you've got a guy getting paid $500,000 a year to just sit on a pedestal and pass judgment on broke people, all the way down to where the cell doors close and certain voices are literally physically locked away. that this institution is based on the idea that some people's words don't matter, that their perspectives are dangers to society. Their ways of living and being, their bodies need to be deeply controlled out of some idea of common good. And frankly, I don't accept any kind of common good that has people in cages, frankly. I know it's a bit of a hard sell, but maybe I'll take you a little bit of the way there. So in another way, though, it's weird that people don't want to talk about prison, because beyond that silence, we're all touched by it, even if you never go there yourself. It's one of the fundamental institutions. It's one of the backbones that holds up society. It's a necessary support for all sorts of daily interactions. For instance, like when I give all my money to a landlord each month, or when I wear myself out doing my boss's bidding, it's the threat of prison that's keeping me there. It keeps us all in line in these ways. And I know this example's just on my mind right now, but I think about this act of getting evicted today and having to pack all of my shit and like move away and dealing with these forms of like precarity, just so that my landlord, a man who's like a rich guy who just owns more homes than he even can live in, he can suck more cash out of us. He can go get a different tenant who's gonna pay him more money. And frankly, there's no way I would leave here if there wasn't prison and police hiding in the background. This is my home. And yet that fear rides me. It rides my friends, rides the people I care about, you know? And that fear was inside of me even before I ever heard like the prison guard jangling their keys, you know? Like it's always been there, even if we can't articulate it. It's one of the things that keeps us, I don't know, keeps us peaceful when we're facing choices between like paying for our phone bills or paying for food. It's just one of those things that lubricates all of these interactions that are fundamentally coerced, you know? And that's the form of the state kind of having this naked violence that kind of keeps us in line, right? And so we can avoid that naked violence when we take the logic of the state, which is its laws, and we internalize them into ourselves and begin to enforce them on ourselves, right? So our experience of peace in society is also our ability to kind of internalize these things, which we have to do because the injustice of it is pretty obvious, right? Like, thinking about who's in jail, like Robin touched on this, it's like pretty glaring that just like some people are filling cages and some people are filling boardrooms, you know? And when we think about where the real violence in society comes from, and we think about that idea of the common good, like personally, I never seen a thief drive a family from their homes, all right? And like here I am having to move out. And I never seen like a shoplifter drive a pipeline through somebody's watershed, poison their future, or even just like doom the children with rising oceans, you know? Like, I think about these kinds of things and I think about the structures of like right and wrong that come along with them. And the things that I see as being more wrong in the eyes of society are individuals standing up for themselves, standing up for their communities, right? And I think that's a reason why as people here today who care about environment stuff, who care about climate change, that sooner or later, if we follow our ideas to their logical conclusion, we're gonna run up against these institutions. We're gonna run up against them in hard ways. And I think we need to build our analysis around that because there's all these systems to hide that violence. Like prison is wrapped up within this kind of beautiful spectacle of the justice system, you know, where everything's just like neat and tidy. And where everybody can use like lots of big words to like justify what underneath is just naked force. It's just bodies in cages. I think we need to come to terms with prison as people who want to resist industrial capitalism, want to resist ecological destruction, who want to resist like terrible outcomes in the future. We need to come to terms with the inevitability of facing repression. Because if you're determined in your struggle, if you take things through to their logical conclusion, if you resist that fear, you're likely to end up there, frankly. I'm likely to end up there again. I don't think we can do this work and care about being effective and also guarantee that we're not gonna go to jail. And that's a scary thought, you know, but I'm not here to scare you today. Like, I really just want us to think honestly about that, because I think one of the ways that we fight fear, which is ultimately the thing that keeps us in line more than police with guns ever could, is through accurate information and through preparation, right? And through knowing that we have each other's backs. Like, our weapon is solidarity. And one of the things that keeps me brave and that made it possible for me to like take risks during this Pride stuff and to hold my head up while I was in jail and come out and feel okay was just knowing that I've got a community of people who for years, like for decades, we've been like building up our analysis around prison. We've been taking our struggle physically to the prison walls. We've been like building links with prisoners. I knew I wasn't gonna be alone. I knew people were gonna be outside that jail, setting off fireworks, spray painting the damn place, sending letters, filling up my canteen, like doing all of these things. And that's not separate from other forms of struggle, because any struggle whether it's around gentrification issues, whether it's around resisting the far right, whether it's around migration, all of these things, sooner or later, you're gonna have to deal with the police. And I think when we talk about climate change, we're talking about lots of different things here, right? So like whether we're talking about the causes of climate change, we're talking about resisting pipelines, or whether we're talking about resisting the violence of borders, which is how the state is trying to deal with the effects of climate change. We're talking about material physical structures, right? And I think thinking about ways to have our resistance to the state and to the world it represents go beyond the kind of rhetorical and symbolic level and touch things on that material level. I think that can be extremely powerful. And it's just a good question to give ourselves is how do we go about this, you know? But one thing just to quickly wrap up, I think I've been going on for about as long as I should here, is one thing that the prison shows me, and I think when we look at it closely, what it can show any of us is that the state is not a tool. It's not just an instrument that we could take charge of and like use differently. It's not a thing we can throw some different party into office and suddenly we'll live in a fundamentally different world. The state is something to overcome. It has its own interests. Those interests are built into it on a material structural level, whether that's prisons or pipelines. And then the state tries to get us to think that its goals are our own. It wants us to internalize its goals and carry those interests around with us, almost as if the state was a part of ourselves, as if it was like our most important relationship, you know? Which in some way it is. Like I feel like in this era where none of us can hold down steady jobs, like the state is very close to us through like welfare and social programs, and the economy is very far away, you know? So like maybe we are just deeply dependent on that. We need to go towards each other and find each other and make the people we care about and share things with our most important relationship again. We need to refuse to be good citizens, to carry the state around, you know? And talking about getting rid of prison in a real material way, that involves sweeping away a lot of the social relations of exploitation that this society is built on. It talks about fundamentally challenging the economic system. It talks about doing away with wage relations, private property. Like a lot of these things are going to be deeply challenged, and we'll probably have to change shape if we actually want to live in a world without prison. Similarly, I mean, talking about climate change, like we're talking about one of the fundamental ways that like material resources are distributed through society, right? And just talking about the way the consequences of that are externalized, the forms of inequality that that produces here and around the world, you know, like that, we're talking about living in a world that none of us has stepped into yet. And one of the first things that I learned going to prison was that I've never been free. And when I think about freedom, when I think about just social relations, I'm talking about taking steps towards a place that I've never been to. I'm talking about drawing the map with our feet as we move. And so in order to do that, we need to find each other. We need to have honest conversations about what we think is appropriate and effective. We need to find ways to break down that fear, build those practices of solidarity, and build up a commitment to action together, you know? And refusing the forms of like mediation that the state puts towards us, like whether it's through political parties or media or social media or whatever, and just focus on our relationships and our ability to act materially. I'm interested in any conversation that takes that as a starting point, and I look forward to talking with you more tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cedar. Again, we're going to encourage folks. We know we have some questions coming in the chat. If you have questions, please continue to put them there. The lovely person from the Leap, Jody, is going to be here going through questions and making sure that they come up at the end. So we're going to leave time for people to ask them. Also, for folks just joining, we're encouraging anyone coming from climate organizing to really think about how we conceptualize of reforms, and that any type of true climate justice work that centers people that need to be heard means throwing reforms out the window and really encouraging that we challenge all types of state marginalization, control, silencing. And we're going to go into some definitions as well. So if folks have clarity that they want on specific words that are unclear, please put them in the chat and we're going to answer them after. We really want to make this as accessible as possible. So we're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, an author, an educator, journalist, and a community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax. In 2016, Elle was the recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She is a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share their creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. Alongside this work, she supports women in Nova Institution in writing and sharing their voices. Elle was recently named the Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University for the 2017-2019 term. Her book of spoken word poetry, Live from the African Resistance, was published in Roseway Press in 2014. Elle would like to pay tribute to the many nameless and unrecognized women whose work makes it possible for her to be here today. Welcome, Elle. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good evening. Can everybody hear me? I was on mute before. Okay. Wow, there's a lot of stress going after like two really brilliant people that have covered so much ground. So I'm going to try and move in the gaps and pick up on maybe a couple of things said by Robin and Cedar. So the first thing I wanted to pick up on a bit is what Cedar talked about with when she said, nobody who's been convicted of stealing has, like run a pipeline through someone's house or evicted someone. So I think a really important point to first engage with is how we think about crime itself, because we sort of think that there's a logic that people commit crimes and that's a reality and then we have to punish it somehow. But of course, corporate crime is never punished. So, if you steal a bottle of pop from Walmart, you're going to do jail time. But if you steal millions and trillions of dollars from people through the banking industry, none of those people served any time in prison. Corporate polluters that are polluting the entire environment are not serving any time in prison, but people that are convicted of assaults on the street are. And that's not to say that the solution is therefore to put more people in prison, like that then we just need to expand prisons, but to point out that that goes to the root of why we think about some crimes as crimes and some crimes as not crimes, and then believe that some people need to be punished. But of course, street crime is treated as crime. And then we call everything else financial crime or white collar crime or some kind of lesser crime that isn't crime. So I think that's really important, because one of the sort of sticking points that people have for thinking about prison abolition is, well, what about victims? What about harm? What about punishment? What about holding people accountable? As though, we hold everybody accountable in equal ways in the first place. So I just wanted to raise that point and pick up on what Cedar already eloquently raised there. The second point I think I want to talk about, and if anybody's read Shireen Razik's book, Race, Space, and the Law, this entire book talks about this. So when we think about the environment, it's kind of vast in some ways, right? Like we're like, okay, and it's everything in the environment. So to kind of narrow down a bit, if we start thinking about space, Shireen Razik talks about this and how space is race. So place is race itself, right? So the examples she gives obviously are at the very root of the settlement of so-called Canada, is this myth of Canada as this wide open space, the true north, strong and free, unpopulated by anybody, and settlers then imagine themselves pioneering through this space. So space itself defines power, it defines race, how we move around society. So the prison obviously interacts with that, right? The prison is a definite space. So if we think about, for example, Joey Twins, who was going to join us today, and who was part of the uprising at the Kingston Prison for Women in the 90s, right? And that was about the way that people are put into space. So putting people into solitary confinement, the literal opening of windows to bring cold air in to harm people. The way that women were then literally had male guards coming in and cutting their clothes off, right? So we think about the prison as a space where these kind of a micro environment where the things that we're more concerned about or think we're concerned about globally outside the prison are really concentrated. The prison is about gender, right? We have men's prisons and women's prisons, and we claim in Canada now we have, trans-friendly prisons, but the reality is a prison is still a gendered space that polices gender. A prison is obviously a class space. It's a space where some people wear uniforms and some people don't. It's a space where some people carry keys and some people don't. It's a race space. So just to think about then how we take that outward into the environment. So just to go and expand on some of what Robin said, it's really important, I think, as we think about things like colonization and enslavement, to understand the role that land had in that in the first place, that environment had in that. So obviously colonization was quite literally about the theft of land, the theft of resources, the theft of labor. We can think about Indigenous people being moved onto reserves, directly moved off places where people were hunting, where people were sustaining the environment, and deliberately put into non-sustainable environments so people then have to struggle to continue generational ways of living. So that's about the environment. Enslavement, there's a sort of myth often that, we were taken into slavery because we were, lesser and didn't have like we were beasts, right? But in fact, of course, they were going to take people that had particular farming knowledges. So the biggest crop in enslavement wasn't cotton, it was sugarcane, right? That's where the vast majority of slaves are taken to in Brazil and across the Caribbean. And sugarcane itself is an incredibly environmentally intensive crop. It uses tons of water. It destroys the land. So we can think of slavery as also a kind of environmental project, displacing people who had sustainable farming knowledge and then bringing them to perform these forms of labor that also then destroy the environment and the plantation system. So I don't have a long time to talk about that, but I want us to also think about how the environment has always been involved in this. And Robin also mentioned this when she talked about borders, the way that climate justice is displacing migrants. So that there's quite literally these forms of like how these interact. The third, I'm trying to go fast, so I'm sorry. I also want to think about the sort of physical building of prisons. So in Nova Scotia, for example, prisons are literally built, or in New Brunswick, and this is true across the country, prisons are most often built in communities that are rural communities, right? So communities that are experiencing loss of resource. So in Nova Scotia, for example, Spring Hill used to be the site of a mine. There's a very famous mining disaster that takes place there. Anne Murray's from there. That's the only other thing that happened in Spring Hill. But the mine closes. The traditional industries are obviously dying off in Nova Scotia. And then those communities build a prison, right? So when they closed Kingston Prison for Women after the riot there, they open up 5 regional prisons for women, and these communities fight over getting these prisons because there's massive construction contracts, there's jobs, right? So rural communities are very invested in the building of prisons, partly because as traditional ways that people had to, like fishing is dying, logging, all these things, other environmentally intensive things come, they build a prison, right? I also want us to think about the prison environment and the kind of architecture of the prison, what that also says about how we think about the environment. Robin mentioned heat waves in there. If you think about in New Orleans during the flood, people were flooded in the jail, right? So they were literally drowning prisoners as this is happening. So these climate crises literally are impacting people who are captive at that moment. In California, where there's the wildfires, we have prisoners fighting those fires as forced labor, right? Who are not even allowed to seek work as firefighters once they finish that. So as the environmental disasters happen, the people quite literally on the front lines drowning and burning and doing this labor are incarcerated people. I also ask us to think about, the space of the prison. Like, what does it mean to build a space with a solitary confinement cell? Ting's chat talks about this with immigration detention. Like, somebody sat in an office and designed this prison, designed the literal environment of the prison without windows. The idea that you get under the Correctional Act 30 minutes a day outside, which you never get. But the idea that we actually say how much fresh air and sunlight and access to the outdoors does somebody need for us not to be violating their rights. During the prison strike in Burnside, that was actually around prison construction, part of the thing that propelled that strike that took place last year. So we're at the 1-year anniversary of prisoners rising up and joining this international prison strike, really in the US, was partly caused by issues of construction, right? So our province putting millions of dollars into constructing prison in this space, not into treatment beds, not into mental health treatment. And then as the prisoners are moved around in that space and promised certain things and then find out they're not getting it and are living in this environment, this is part of what contributes to that uprising, right? So what I'm saying here is that when we talk about the environment, we tend to sort of think about the outdoors and we're talking about the ocean, we're talking about land, but we're also talking about the way that people live, and prisons really encapsulate that, right? The kind of relationships that are broken, as Cedar said, prisons produce silence, right? What does it mean to have this hidden space? So to go back to Spring Hill, I always kind of joke when I go there that the town should literally have up signs this way to the prison, because why else is anybody in Spring Hill? We're all there to visit people in prison, yet they completely hide it. So I'm they should be welcome families of prisoners, because we're the only people that are placing resources into that environment, right? But they would never do that. It's both what the town depends on and what is completely hidden in the town. I also just wanted to raise things. So around the prison strike, food was an issue there. So access to sustainable foods, these things that we talk about as issues that are accepted as issues we need to care about until they're present in the prison. So, when we don't have access to any kind of food in a prison, they shut down the prison farms in Nova Scotia that were prisoners were farming to produce fresh food. So we talk about, we need more sustainable organic farming, and then we make sure that prisoners don't even have access to any kind of food that they can eat, right? So what does it mean for climate justice movement if we say these things are true, except not counting this group of people, except depending upon this group of people? So if we want justice, justice always has to depend on all the people involved in that justice. So, you know, like if we talk about the need for food, why don't we talk about the need for food for prisoners? Now, of course, the answer isn't, as Robin said, like, okay, so let's just like build a farm for prisoners. Like, why don't we have an organic food shop for prisoners? The point is that you can never access those things, and those things will never be true while the prison exists. I also just want to highlight the role of prison expansion in Cape Breton right now, which is another, you know, economically depressed area that has lost traditional industries. So of course, there's a plan to build a new prison there. So, you know, that our government at this time has this time to do this incredibly environmental destructive thing, which is literally the building of the prison, which creates all kinds of pollution, cuts down all kinds of trees, like the building of roads into that prison. Like the prison itself is an environmentally intensive, destructive moment. So I just have highlighted those kind of things. I'm trying to go fast. I know I sort of covered a lot, and Robin and Cedar have also gone over that ground. I think when we talk about abolition, some of the sort of blocks people have on it are, you know, questions around harm, what about the victim, and also questions around like, what does it mean? So if we close the prison tomorrow, does that mean that, you know, our streets will be overrun by, you know, murderers and rapists, right? But we have to think about prison abolition as also a form of relationship building in communities. It's a form of living in different ways with each other. So what does it mean as a community to hold each other accountable for harm? Because a prison doesn't actually hold anybody accountable for harm. It punishes people, but it doesn't ask people what they need. It doesn't ask the victim for closure. You know, we have an idea that there's a binary between offender and victim, and not the idea that, of course, most people who are being victimized are also criminalized and vice versa, right? There's not this easy division. So this kind of binary that we think of, it's very classic of capitalist thought, very classic of how we think about all other things, the gender binary, you know, the idea that there's racial binaries, you know, this is also playing out in how we think about punishment. So as we talk about abolition, it's about coming into new relationships as well. So in the same way as a colonial capitalist society asks us to not be in relationship with the land, it asks us to not be in relationship with nature, it asks us to not be in relationship with ourselves in particular ways, right? Like the ways that we have to consume around that, the ways that we don't live, I don't mean to sound like a hippie here or whatever, I don't know, but, you know, like live in harmony. But that's a real thing. Like we sometimes say these things as though they're cliches, but it has meaning, like what it means to live in a balanced way, right? And prison abolition also asks that of us as we transform justice, right? It asks us to think about what it would mean to take care of each other as a community, which also would involve taking care of land. It asks us what it would mean when somebody does harm to actually repair that and to actually think about that, you know? Nobody thinks the prison is going to close tomorrow, you know, that suddenly we're just going to close the prison. But the work we have to do in the meantime, as the prison is not closing, as we fight for that, is also ask ourselves in our communities every day what forming that justice looks like, right? So if we can't in our friends circles, you know, when somebody causes harm and we want to defend them because we don't know how to deal with sexual assault in our communities, if we can't do that work, we're not going to do the work of prison abolition, right? If we can't hold ourselves accountable for the ways that we consume or the ways that we cause harm, how are we going to then ask ourselves to do it on a broader scale? So I think that kind of daily work, which is about asking ourselves hard questions, is about how we live in community, is also an environmental question, right? Because we live in communities that ask us to, you know, be destructive on a daily basis, right? Of, you know, to live among concrete, you know, to not know how to farm, to not have the resources to farm, to not have the resources to care for ourselves in basic ways, to not get mental health care, to not be able to care for our children, to not be able to care for each other. And that is what a prison is based on as well. That is what a carceral mindset is, about the absence of care and putting punishment in place. And that is also, of course, what capitalist colonial patriarchy is as well. So I hope that's all right, and I will end there.
Thank you so much, Elle. We've touched on a million different aspects of this topic right now. So, and Jody has been recording questions. So I think we're going to go directly into that. So we've got about 15 minutes left. But we're drawing on also for folks who are just joining or jumping in the conversation, is we have a really good historicization that Robin touched on, also the ways in which the colonial project is implemented in today. We understand that the disposability of human beings in prisons is ultimately a form of the capitalist project being expanded, and that the expansion of prisons is so much more a real life manifestation of what it means to create ultimate disposability of human beings. And we described it in a bunch of different ways, but we're of course talking about what it means to actually make real restorative and transformative justice in our communities, and how this is really a climate issue ultimately. And we're talking about not only just the reforms that come from, you know, I'm thinking about, as all of you are speaking, the Group of Seven paintings, which I think a lot of like really white climate organizers like to think about when we think of the environment, which of course had the complete erasure of indigenous communities, of racialized communities, of sustainable ways of living on the land. And that's what prisons do. They kind of erase all of the world that goes on behind the climate and just thinks about the ways in which people can be punished for what they do. And we don't really think about the contextualization of these issues. So we're going to jump into a bunch of questions. I know we have a lot, so we're going to throw to Jody for our first question, and anyone on the panel can answer it. Go for it, Jody.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm going to combine two of the questions that we've received. The first one is one that we actually received over email. And Cedar, you touched on the structures of right and wrong and how we understand what those mean. Elle, you talked about how we understand what a crime is considered. And so someone has asked, given the context of increased climate change-related displacement and the rise of far-right nationalist violence, how should we think about consequences for hate groups, individuals who are enacting violence, people like fossil fuel executives? How do we think about that within the framework of prison abolition and transformative justice? And a related question in the chat from Tina. Tina's asked, how can we fight carceral attitudes in our movements? And how do we build community accountability that respects and upholds everyone's inherent dignity?
I feel like Cedar should take this time.
I can take a first crack at it. I mean, I've been thinking about the stuff with the far right a lot these days, honestly. And I feel like some of that, the answer to that question of how do we deal with people who carry out these forms of like intense harm is just like, to me, it's tied to just the understanding that prisons don't fix anything. They only make problems worse, you know? Like, I feel like there's really good questions to ask about like, well, what do you do about X kind of person if there's no prison or something? I'm like, literally, I think we could get rid of the institution of prison tomorrow and actually just flat out make the world a better place. Like, I don't think it's solving any problems. So that said, what do we do from there? Like, in some ways it's really exciting. In some ways it's really scary. Like, honestly, like taking responsibility for how conflict plays out in our communities is like, it has some beautiful aspects. It also involves things that are really scary, right? Like, for me and like most of the people I live around in the neighborhoods I live in, like just not calling the cops is just a fact of life, right? Like, we don't expect anything good to come from them. Like when people at Pride got attacked, like people were seriously injured. Like I had several friends go to the hospital. Not one person called the cops. Not one person made a statement. We dealt with that ourselves, you know? And whether that dealing with that ourselves looked like rolling as a crew and like driving those motherfuckers out of the park, or whether it looked like sitting with your friends in the hospital, like making them food in the next few days and just like being caring and looking after each other, you know? Like these things are scary. They're also powerful. And I think it's small steps towards imagining a different kind of world in which we don't rely on these sort of like outside authorities to tell us what we think is good or bad and how we should deal with it. So like when I look at these institutions like prisons or police, I want to ask myself what it is we wish they would do, and then ask if we can do it ourselves, and how do we build the skills and the forms of organization to pull that off, right? Like if we want people to be able to intervene in conflicts, like actually like we can do that. We can build those skills. We can be really brave and we can try to make situations better. And do we want, like Elle said, I feel like you said it really well, talking about building like accountability for harm. How do we want to deal with behaviors that are unacceptable? You know, like first we've got to decide what those behaviors are, and then we've got to figure out some sort of way of working on it, you know? And I feel like a lot of communities already do, because again, like calling the police for every like fucked up thing your friends do is only going to make the thing worse. Like we've all experienced far too much harm from that, you know? So I think just taking that as a starting point, then when we look at these people who are doing actual like serious harm, like fascists and capitalists, to me, the problem isn't necessarily one of like getting retribution for every little thing. It's about taking their power away. Like, I don't actually need to live in a world where I can like dominate other people, which is why I don't want to take over the state. Like, I don't want anybody to have my way of thinking enforced on them. You know, I want to live in like countless different ways, which like I think is one of the ways like that thinking about like indigenous autonomy and like indigenous sovereignty is like a fundamental challenge to how we think about politics and society, just because it involves like respecting the autonomy of communities, you know, and just like fragmenting things and doing away with big central authorities. But I think if you just take away their ability to have that power and to like take their hand off the world, then I think some of those problems become less, and we can deal with them as individuals like we would deal with problems with our neighbors, frankly. Like, I think if there weren't these like huge corporations, there wasn't the wage economy that allows them to direct the activity of like thousands of people. If there weren't like cops to come through and like drive people off of their territories to make way for industrial expansion, like I think this would be a different conversation. So to me, it comes back to power and how to flatten out power.
Absolutely. Elle, did you want to go next?
No, it's okay. You can go if you are going to answer.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Cedar, for that answer. And I mean, I think I'll just jump into, I think just really wanting to echo something that Elle brought up earlier, and which is that those that commit the most egregious harms and violence in terms of what we would associate with criminality in our society are those that are going unpunished, right? So if we think about the massive amount of war crimes committed by the United States government over decades, like those are the people that will never see the inside of a prison cell. So if we think about sort of the most vast and vicious and destructive kinds of violence and death that we see caused in the world, we realize, and Cedar pointed to this as well, that it's almost like considered impossible to imagine that there could be any sort of kind of punishment for this kind of crime. So this asks us really to think about then who do we expect are those who can be accountable for their actions. The people that are behind bars are largely there for, like if we think about in women's prisons, for example, largely poverty crimes, largely people living with mental health issues, regardless of their race. So the only people that are really held to account are people that are very marginalized economically, socially, racially. So it makes us understand, I think, that prison was never about addressing harm, right? It was never about addressing violence, because we know who the largest perpetrators of violence are. Even if we think about the city of Toronto, the kinds of violence that the police have meted out on Black populations over the last several decades is not seen as, the same kind of harm as we talk to when people talk about, for example, like, other kinds of issues, right? So we see that it's almost the more power, the higher the level of impunity. So then if we have that question, like what would happen if like the murderers and the rapists were all out there, but the fact is that they are, right? They're the president of the United States. They're many of the world leaders. So it's actually our question for ourselves is, how do we create a world in which that kind of violence and brutality is not celebrated, but is made intolerable? Like if we think about different kinds of movements toward massive economic justice and economic redistribution that would undo the many crimes of ongoing wealth pillaging and theft, and the mass impoverishment of the vast majority of the world's populations, which again, if crime was about harm, then that would be the crime, right? But it's not about saying that then the beneficiaries of the first world should be in jail, but it's about saying, how do we change that relationship? How do we change the acceptability of that relationship, of that kind of theft? So I could say more, but I want to leave time for Elle to answer on it.
I was just going to say as well that, I mean, one of the sort of conversations that happens when we talk about abolition, obviously I'm not interested in a conversation that involves, telling people they have to forgive their rapists or something like that. But I think that, like the way, so for example, when we sort of say, okay, well, murderers, like that's, like we create this division. So there's the non-violent people that, okay, maybe we can think about abolishing prisons for, but then there's this other group of people. And I don't think that that's necessarily, I don't think there's a productive division. Most of the people I work with are the murderers, right? Like the shooters, those are people who actually contact me. And those people are also capable of transformative justice and change. So to address a direct case, I had a very close friend who, when he was in serving life, there was another lifer who had been a Nazi and, came in with swastikas all over him and everything. And he was like, well, like cover that shit up when you're around me kind of thing. And then they ended up talking on the range, and they ended up essentially like this person recognized. So they said, well, my sister was raped by a Black guy. And then I like became this Nazi thinking that I could extend this to all Black people. And now that I'm talking to you, so these things take place in prisons all the time. People are doing the work of addressing their harm more than anybody else is. People, because that's people who have to live with it, right? So people that are every day talking to each other about, I have conversations with people in prison about domestic violence, that have committed domestic violence, and like understanding their harm. Like this happens, right? And it's not happening because of the prison. The prison isn't making that happen. It's people that are building communities and talking to each other. So that doesn't mean, is everybody doing that work? Not necessarily, but it's possible, right? So I think it's not necessarily a productive division to say, okay, these people are murderers, these people are this, these people are that, and that prison abolition, our limits of the imagination can't extend there because these are the bad people. And that's a really difficult conversation on abolition, because it always feels like the conversation that no one wants to have, because then it makes us vulnerable to like the public, right? Like public safety or whatever, right? But who is this public, right? When Ralph Goodale is deporting people in the name of the public, who is that public imagined to be? It's imagined to be a white middle class, particular kind of public, right? The public is never all of us. The public is an imagined construction, and then those people need to be kept safe. That's why policing keeps safe the public, but only certain neighborhoods, right? So I think these kind of ways of thinking, it's hard and it's complex. I never think it's an easy conversation. I think we don't talk enough when we talk about things like abolition about the complications, right? That everybody I know who does this work has points where you're like, oh, you know, I don't know how I feel about this person. I have to, you know, advocate this person. And I may not, like, this person's a dangerous sex offender, but I still have to think about how rights work in that situation, right? And sometimes there's lines people don't feel comfortable going over. And we have those conversations. It's not a settled thing where you're like, okay, I'm an abolitionist and then I'm done. You know, like, it is complex and it's complicated because we're dealing with human beings. And I think sometimes we don't talk enough about how difficult that is and the decisions we make and the ethical problems we have. But that's living in complication is how we build new spaces, right? It's not supposed to be simple. And it's not some kind of knock on us when we move with difficulty or are inconsistent in our thought, or are like, I don't like prisons, but I kind of feel like this person should be in prison. Like, these are all ways that people live, right? And that's okay. I don't think we need to act like it's settled. I think the whole point is that we're willing to enter into a space of difficulty and complexity, because that's actually a relational space. So, you know, like, what do we do about Nazis we don't have to have that like complete answer, but what we have to say is, does violence meet with violence? Have we ever solved patriarchy through more patriarchy? Have we solved rape by a prison? No. You know, a prison is not going to solve rape, but if it's the only option you have to keep yourself safe from your rapist, it's the option you have. But that doesn't mean that it's a long-term or preventative option that's going to address why sexual violence happens, right? And right now, we may not have the tools to do that. So I'm not saying to anybody, you not solve these questions, and we're not having conversations, then, you know, are we really addressing any kind of harm through a prison system that costs us all kinds of money and like literally does nothing? You know, resources that could be put anywhere else.
Thank you so much, Al. And thank you to everyone who joined our panel and all of you attendees for joining. We're going to share it with your friends. We're also going to send out an email afterwards so that folks can follow up with different issues that Al, Robin, and Cedar all touched on. If you want to get involved in the work that they mentioned, you absolutely should. We'll follow up with ways that you can do that. But thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining. It was a fantastic discussion, and I think we all learned a lot. We're really grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having us.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Oh, I was waving, but I turned myself off already. Bye, everybody.
Bye.